Again, or
Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we are going to be discussing spaces of resistance, the case of Zapatismo. And Zapatismo has created a crack in history with their stance against neoliberalist tendencies that the Mexican government implemented over 20 years ago now with the NAFTA treaty. And so this community in Chiapas decided that they were going to stand up for their living rights, and their call for justice, democracy, and sovereignty became, from the radical military movement that they began with, has transformed over the past 10 years into a very inspiring self-governance type of community that we will be discussing more in detail with today's guest, who has specialized in this subject, of course. So we have Anthony Faramelli from the UK. Hello, Anthony. Welcome to the Hangout.
hi. Thank you for having me today. It's an honor to talk about some of my work in this field.
Great. I'd like to introduce you to our audience. Anthony lectures in Media and Culture Studies and Sociology at Kingston University. He completed his PhD in Critical Humanities at Kingston University in the London Graduate School, and he's undergoing training in group analysis in the Institute of Group Analysis, and he focuses on his writings about psychosocial theory and politics. So to all our audience, remember that there are questions and comments available throughout the Hangout. We will be discussing at least 40 minutes, more likely more than that, because it's a vast subject. So feel free to ask, comment as we go. So let's get on to the discussion, Anthony. How can we start with describing what Zapatismo is as a resistant movement as opposed to revolution?
Okay, I think there's a couple things that are really important to disentangle to begin with. Specifically, the most important thing would be the difference between revolution and resistance. And my understanding of these terms perhaps has a slightly specific meaning. I take revolution to mean the complete ontological transformation of the world. It's characterized by processes that are violent, maybe not necessarily physically violent, but at least psychically violent, if not physically. And its orientation is by necessity future-based. You know, it has a future orientation, which means that it's characterized by a certain Prometheism. You know, that is, you want to hit this future point. And also the notion of acceleration. That means the whole goal is to move as fast as possible at an ever accelerating speed towards the future. Resistance, contra to that is this idea of resistance. Resistance can only be something that happens very slow, and it's situated very much in the now, in the present moment. So in many ways, resistance and revolution are not very compatible to one another. My personal bias, and we can flesh a lot of these things out in questions later. I'm kind of summarizing hundreds of pages worth of research that I've done in a few sentences. So I'm happy to kind of think about this more in the questions. But I see revolution as being very problematic as a discourse. That its Prometheism and its acceleration in particular lead to a certain, to simplify it, the means justify the ends. But then in order to get to the ends, you become so corrupted by the means that the end point is no longer even possible. And there might be kind of moments of rupture, moments of break, where you do have this kind of utopic moment within a revolution, but it's very temporary. And once you move past it, you end up with things like, Napoleon in the French Revolution, Stalin in the Russian Revolution, Algeria, which is something that I focus on quite a bit, falling into a totalitarian state and then a bloody civil war. So my interest then is resistance. I know one way to think about resistance, a kind of classic way, actually comes from the very kind of reactionary right military historian Clausewitz, who talks about resistance as disenabling your enemy's capacity to attack you. So that's kind of a good way to begin thinking about this, where resistance means always resisting an enemy or an oppositional force is maybe better. And then I bring my own work in psychosocial theory and group analysis into this. In group analysis, the way the therapeutic model functions within a group is you actively kind of resist each other. You know, that means as you're working within a group, I start perhaps trying to dominate a conversation, trying to impose my will upon the group. And then as the group resists that, then that's where the therapy becomes enacted. So it's this model of active resistance that's never ending. And through that, the therapy is enacted. So that tends to be how I think of this notion of resistance, through this kind of therapeutic model. Politically speaking, then, if you're thinking about resisting another force, or an oppositional force, this has an orientation towards what people like Deleuze and Guattari refer to as micropolitics, or politics that originate at the level of, the psyche or the self. So this means, implicitly resisting my own urges to dominate others. Now, all this produces a certain kind of way of being, a subjectivity, or you can also say an identity. One thing I noticed, anecdotally in my own experience working in activist groups, was you're either a revolutionary or you're against us. If you're not for the revolution, then you're a reformist, you're a sellout, you're the enemy, and you should be eliminated. And this metastasizes in things, again, if you look at the French Revolution, the Terror, the Russian Revolution, the Purges, and all of this kind of elimination, very, very fascistic kind of elimination is getting to an end point. Resistance, and this is why revolutionaries don't like resistance, because resistance means also resistance to revolution. It means that we don't go fast. We have to slow down, we have to think about what we're doing, and we have to resist our own temptation to eliminate those who disagree with us. And it means change happens, well, as they say, within Zapatismo, at the rate of a snail. In fact, that's one of the great axioms that you find within the Zapatista writings. It's my personal favorite. We walk slowly because we have a long way to go. And this is. Oh, go on.
I totally agree on that whole recognition that many times we have this tendency of, oh, we want change now, so we go and take the government and bring it down, and that has, as you've said, proven throughout history to be not working for the principles that were intended to be placed in the first place, and how that becomes like a notion of, oh, that doesn't work, that kind of change doesn't work, so change won't work, therefore we stay the same. So in this process, as you were mentioning, really thinking of your next move and being able to consider space, time, and how you develop such changes, there is also a sense of identity and a sense of collectivity that is formed, not only in the sense of going against, but how are we going to organize ourselves? So how can you describe then Zapatismo as a movement with regards to this?
Well, what happened with the Zapatista movement is really interesting. A lot of people think about it as starting January 1st, 1994, with the armed uprising in Chiapas, where they took control of 7 different municipal centers, including the capital, San Cristobal de las Casas. And that's very important. It's a very important moment. But that's not really how the Zapatista movement and Zapatismo began. what happened was in 1983, you had a group of kind of Marxist, Leninist guerrillas go to the jungles to start a new revolutionary movement. And they were very traditional in their approach to revolution, very much inspired by what happened in Cuba, very much thinking, we're going to be a vanguard, revolutionize the indigenous population here, march to the future. And they always talk about long before 94, the revolutionary movement was utterly defeated. And it was defeated by the indigenous population. They weren't so quick to sign up to this kind of revolutionary vanguard Marxist idea. So then they had to dramatically rethink what they were doing. And they did it in a way that was really intelligent. They engaged with a lot of the people and very slowly started building communities to the point where the original group was called the FLN, until the FLN dissolved, and then they kind of adopted the legacy of Zapata and became the Zapatistas. And then slowly over time, the communities decided that the state of affairs, both within Mexico and globally through the world integrated capitalist system, became insufferable. So they had to make a dramatic entry into the world stage of politics. And that's where February or January 1st, 94 happened. But from a military point of view, it's really weird what happened. It makes no sense, really. They launched their offensive in the morning of January 1st, the same day the NAFTA comes into effect. And that was symbolic for a lot of reasons, mainly because that launched Mexico fully into the integrated system of neoliberal world economics. So they launched this offensive, took control of 7 municipalities, including the capital, San Cristobal, but then they pulled back. And that was really strange. And that's part of the kind of history of transformation that they went through. They put out the first declaration, calling on all of Mexico to revolt. But what happened was there was large-scale protests, but not against the government, but also against fighting in general. The Zapatistas that first morning had the military advantage, but instead of pushing the offensive forward, which would have been the good revolutionary thing to do, they pulled back. And they said, what we want to do, and they shortly thereafter, like a couple weeks later, a few days actually later, put out the second declaration. And the second declaration just said, we don't want to take power. This is not ostensibly, I'm paraphrasing, this isn't a revolution. We don't want to just take power. We want to create a space for true democracy to happen, for true communication. And this is explicitly a resistant space. It's a space where a large group, in this case contextualized within Mexico, can resist each other's pushes to dominate, and in that way enact some kind of transformation. That happens as a negotiation between these different groups coming into conversation. Of course, from a military point of view, that this is why the Mexican military was so able to quickly beat them back. But I think that moment, I think the significance of that moment really can't be overlooked, because they didn't push for a military offensive beyond that first victory when they really should have, from a certain kind of, classic revolutionary point of view. They wanted to create a space for dialogue, a space for them to resist each other. And I think that's what's really important. And then since then, they've been going through constant transformations, 20 years, 21 years of transformations. But the most important one was the Sixth Declaration and the corresponding La Otra, the other campaign. With La Otra, they conducted what they refer to, again, very much in the kind of psychosocial framework, a diagnostic of suffering, where they sent people throughout Mexico up into the United States to kind of conduct, like what they said, field research on the state of affairs, thinking of the state of affairs for women, for LGBTQ people, for people who are disabled. Significantly, they're one of the first kind of radical movements to really think through issues of like ability versus disability, and to kind of think this through and what constitutes an abled body versus a disabled body. They put a lot of thought into that. For indigenous rights, race issues, ethnic issues, issues of religion. So they came back with this kind of set of data, if you would. And then they put out the Sixth Declaration. Within the Sixth Declaration, that's where the military organization of the Zapatistas began to officially dissolve and turn into something very different. You saw the establishment of, in English it's the snails, the caracos, as centers, community centers, but also centers of judicial reform, where any community can go to these centers now with disputes and handle the disputes there. Education centers, health centers, all these things started happening. And they internationalized themselves in an amazing way. But at the same time, they made a complete claim of autonomy. It's no more we're going to work with the government, we're going to work with civil society. They just kind of took their autonomy. And this data is a bit old. The figures are greater now. But as of 2007, it was more than 40% of Chiapas had basically signed up to the Sixth, and were using the Caracos rather than official Mexican government channels. And that's now people there's no reliable data really, but it's more than 50% today in Chiapas.
Can you walk us on how these juntas de buen gobierno or councils for good governance operate? How have they managed to implement them, and how effective they've been?
Well, I think a lot of their effectivity is proven insofar as a lot of non-Zapatista communities only use these councils, and will travel with their disputes to have them settled at the councils of good governance, rather than their own systems, as predicated on them by the Mexican state. The way the councils work, every person within the community has an equal say in what happens. It's a direct democratic vote. Every person in the community has to serve within the council, on a rotating basis. So then, as you move through the councils, if someone comes there with a dispute, the council collectively meets, decides. If there's any dissenting opinion, then it's a long process, but the judicial process then is settled through a direct democratic negotiation through the entire community, as represented by those who it's their turn to serve.
How are they elected in such cases?
Well, they're not elected because everyone serves there.
So it's just like a rotation schedule, so to speak?
Yeah, like a rotation schedule.
Okay, and yeah, go for it.
No, go on.
I was going to ask in terms of how they have managed to precisely resist their desire. We kind of know that human beings have this tendency of wanting to be on top and create or recreate oligarchy even in this movement. So how has that process been contained or prevented or resisted?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the kind of identity that forms through this process. I would argue, following a certain kind of lineage of philosophic thought, that identity is always formed in the wake of a communal movement, or a communal desire. So if you think of desire as kind of having a like a wind, or a wave, passing through, then your understanding of who you are is formed in the wake of that passing. So a lot of people want change. That's we can take that as a really banal kind of basis. So then, as the movement pushes through, how that change is effected, depends, or how we understand ourselves, our sense of identity, our sense of self, is dependent on how we go about affecting that change as a community, as a group. And this process, this very, very slow process that's dependent on everyone having a voice, everyone using their voice, and everyone actively kind of pushing against each other, means that the way we understand ourselves is not so much fixed. It's a bit more, the boundaries around our understanding are a bit more porous, it's a bit more fluid, and we're a lot more adaptable. So I think that's the biggest contribution that we have from Zapatismo, is this idea that we have a more fluid understanding of self, that is able to adapt, communicate, and incorporate notions of the other in a way that's previously really not seen so much, or ever, really. So I think that's the most important aspect.
So in terms of these psychosocial dynamics that you've investigated on as well, what are the most prominent points that you can identify as what makes of the people developing Zapatismo as very, like able to be identified as an example that others can follow, for example, and that are already implementing in other places around the world?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, because like we were chatting earlier, you get communities that, like, there's a community in Harlem in New York called La Barrio that very explicitly organizes themselves along the principles of Zapatismo, as predicated by the Sixth. A large area of Kurdish North Syria, where Kobani is within that boundary, where the massive battle just happened, they organize themselves on the same principles, and again, explicitly making nod to Zapatismo after the Sixth. The Sixth is a very important moment, in the history of global politics, really. So the kind of key components there is ostensibly an absolute direct democracy, an absolute vote, but also more philosophically, it's just a kind of understanding of history and an understanding of space. And this is a bit more theoretical, I suppose. But the way you get these notions kind of narrated, history is no longer linear. It's no longer one event building on the next event, on the next event, on this kind of progression upwards. But they kind of take this idea where it's almost like a piece of paper with different points on it that's folded over, and then folded over and folded over. So all the different points, instead of moving in a straight line, get kind of mixed up, and then they're all next to each other. Like this is what's really interesting. Like look the kind of the recent famous case where you had this persona, Marcos, Subcomandante Marcos, and Marcos kind of emerged. We know his real name is, of course, not Marcos, it's Rafael. He adopted the name Marcos after another kind of military leader within the FLN who was killed early on, named Marcos. So that's where Marcos adopted his name from. And he emerged early on as a spokesperson for the movement. For the last several years, after the Sixth came out, actually, Marcos kind of took a step back from public life. wasn't making speeches, wasn't making appearances. And this was explicit because, he didn't, the movement thought that there was a cult of personality forming around him, and they didn't want him to become another Che, basically. But recently, about, I guess, 6 months ago now, maybe about that, a paramilitary group attacked a Zapatista community and killed a teacher whose name was Guillermo. And then in the memorial for him, Marcos made his first public appearance in 6 years, and announced that Marcos was dead. For all intents and purposes, there is no more Marcos. And then, in a very kind of dramatic, theatrical way, he was reintroduced as Subcomandante Guillermo. And now, there is no more Marcos, it's just Guillermo. Like, there's never a motion of speaking from the position of I, only a position of speaking from the moment of we. And everyone speaking, when you articulate this we, is everyone within the resistance. Everyone alive today who has already died, and everyone who has yet to be born. So it's kind of like all these points in history fold over. So everyone then informs one another. All these different moments in history that happened now, that happened before, it's like they're happening at the same time, and they inform each other and resist each other, in a specific way. And that's, from a philosophic point of view, I think that's one of the most interesting discourses. And the way that this is no longer limited to, say, Chiapas or even Mexico, but on a global scale. All these points are happening at the same time. And in this way, time takes on a spatial dimension. So the space of resistance then is no longer a physical lived space, although that's part of it, but it's also a kind of philosophic space, or a space, discursive space, you can say, that exists, and that's where these identities are created. The idea that you can be a Zapatista in northern Syria, or a Zapatista in New York, or a Zapatista in Chiapas, and that the same, Zapata can speak to you in any of these places and inform what you're doing, and then you in turn inform what Zapata is doing. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. This idea that the dead are always with us. And that's something that you see explicit in a lot of these different movements around the world, too, the way that they've adopted this way of thinking of the dead, and of time in general.
So in terms of how they have managed to evolve, let's say, from this militarized movement to what became more about self-governance and developing this autonomy, you wrote that they live as if they have already won. So what does this imply in the practical sense?
Well, in the practical sense, that's basically the claiming of their autonomy. That's the establishment of the good governance boards, of the carcos, and that's just this refusal to work with the Mexican government, or any government for that matter, and just say, screw it, we've won.
So do they manage themselves in terms of basic services? How does that operate?
Yeah, no, they have their own schools, that they have their own education system that they've set up. In fact, really basic things like literacy. Literacy pre-94, these facts are off the top of my head, so I could be wrong. If anyone out there is on Wikipedia, I welcome you to double check me here. But I think literacy was something around 21% in Chiapas, and now it's well over 70. Access to education is within Zapatista areas, or areas working within the Sixth, is 100% universal. Access to education is also universal. Before, oftentimes women were not given access to education. That's no longer the case. In fact, women have always taken a very, very visible position within Zapatismo. Which is in and of itself quite spectacular given the kind of machismo culture that you get in a lot of areas throughout the Latin America. The participation of disabled, of LGBTQ, all of this stuff has dramatically increased. Health services also, they've set up their own hospitals, their own medical centers. There's not a lot of money trading places within the communities, but anything they do need money for that they have to take in, say, outside their communities that they can't grow or manufacture themselves, their chief export is coffee. And there's places all over the world, like I was saying, that there's a few cafes and shops here in London you can buy Zapatista coffee at. But for the most part, anything they need, they grow or they manufacture themselves.
So it's like very related to the lifestyle that they've also had as a community. I mean, we're talking about indigenous people that had always been like self-sustainable, and the governmental imposition was hindering their ability to simply grow and continue thriving as a community. Is this correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, thinking specifically of Mexico, one of the really significant things with NAFTA was the ejido. Ejido were kind of self-sustaining communal farming that happened throughout Mexico. Traditionally, it was guaranteed as one of the key aspects within the Mexican Revolution. Ironically, or maybe not ironically enough, that was the key aspect that Zapata pushed for. But the ejido system was disbanded with NAFTA. Subsidies for specifically corn were done away with under NAFTA. All of this thing, basically Mexico destroyed the entire base of agriculture and the entire way of life for indigenous people or anyone living outside of Mexico City, really, was destroyed so Mexico can, play ball with all the other G8 countries. It was really brutal how Mexico just slashed and burned everything in order to sign up to NAFTA, actually. And the result in a lot of areas, especially northern Mexico, was mass starvation when the corn harvest the next year was very poor. We had these great instances of like women wearing bandanas, like kind of Wild West style. These women with like bandanas and rifles, like stopping trains, that had corn coming in from California to rob the corn. But yeah, so a lot of this was kind of reclaiming what they already knew to work. The problem with this is that obviously it works really well in rural Chiapas. I don't think a lot of people in London or New York or Mexico City are going to start growing their own food or even have the ability or resources to grow their own food. But Zapatismo is not, the Zapatista discourses here are very specific, that ours is not a model of resistance. We resist with the tools that we have at our disposal. A lot of those tools are a history of agriculture, self-sustainability. These are things that we have, are tools that we use to resist.
There is a question here coming from Jean Kenny, so let's get to it. She's saying, how can change the perception that resistance implies a Marxist challenge to capitalism instead of the implementation of direct democracy? Maybe she implies, how can we change the perception?
Okay, well, how can we change the perception that resistance implies a Marxist challenge to capitalism instead of the implementation of direct democracy? I mean, I guess I would wonder what you specifically mean by a Marxist challenge to capitalism. Like there is a certain idea of use value and surplus value that you can take from Marxism. But this isn't really. I think this is about something a lot deeper than kind of just a basic fundamentalist Marxist challenge to capitalism. It would be more interesting or more worthwhile, I think, to think of Marx in this case as more of a critical thinker rather than any kind of programmatic system. I don't think we need to challenge anything instead of direct democracy. I think direct democracy is actually a tenet that you see within Zapatismo. Capitalism as itself isn't sustainable within any kind of direct democratic vote, since capitalism is predicated on a repressed underclass. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I guess resisting domination means implicitly resisting capitalism, since capitalism relies on an oppressed underclass, you know. But one thing that I'm interested in, and that you see within Zapatismo, is moving away from dogmatic Marxism. You know, Marx as analysis of capitalism is great. Marx as providing the tools of critical thinking is great, but I don't think we're thinking programmatically, you know, communist in this way, but more of a Marxist means of understanding the scientific rationale behind capitalism. You know, that's something that John Holloway makes when he speaks about this, you know, in his idea of changing the world without taking power in his writings, is that Zapatismo is more interested in the Marx of diagnostic rather than the Marx of programs. If that answers your question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, let's ask Jean if you have a further question or comment on that, just let us know. So in this, what are the primary challenges that you would see Zapatismo is going to be facing either already or in the near future as the creation of future itself?
Well, I think this is an interesting point. Again, kind of turning back to the notion of time, the future is already happening. So it's not really a notion of moving towards the future, but rather how can we change our present moment? There's no Prometheanism. There's no orientation towards, you know, next 10 years, next 20 years. It's more focused on what do we need now? How do we change everything now? You know, we want our future to be today, not in 10 years. And I think that is a kind of never-ending movement, right? But for challenges, for very practical challenges, well, the first one, the kind of obvious one, is the environmental challenge. I know specifically thinking of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, for years now, they've been trying to turn the Lacondan jungle into a kind of eco-tourist resort. And the Mexican government is trying to use the idea that farmers within the Lacondan is ecologically damaging. So in order to help, you know, from a, and this is, you know, the bullshit from the Mexican government, you know, so from a green perspective, we have to root the Zapatistas out and then turn the Lacondan into an eco-preserve. Now, of course, what they want to do is turn it into a tourist eco-preserve to start generating American tourist dollars. You know, so like rich people can drive there in SUVs and then go, oh, look, we're being green. You know, so I mean, that's what's going to happen. You know, if they're successful.
Those are the risks, I'd say, also when you have also that kind of very attractive notion of lifestyle. And as you were mentioning before the hangout, I didn't want to be part of that revolutionary tourism, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But it may happen. It is already.
No, there's a great story that Marcos used to always tell about why he would always carry a red left high heel to meetings with different NGOs. Because after the conditions of a lot of the people in Chiapas became global. People were globally aware of the poverty in the area. A lot of kind of kind-hearted people from Europe and America started sending things through NGOs. But a lot of the shit they sent was just ridiculous. And one of them, and this kind of, they started getting these boxes just arriving in Zapatista communities that were just full of like dresses and stuffed animals, and one of them, there was one red high heel shoe, the left one, but not its mate. So it's like, okay, what are we going to do with high heels in the jungle, in the mountains to begin with? And why did you only send one? But this idea of kind of paternalism, like, oh, look at the poor people over there. How can we good, rich, liberal capitalists help the poor people? Especially there's this kind of racist element to it as well. Oh, look at the poor Indians, And this is a horrible, I think this is a massive challenge to get over. Like Marcos was really specific. We don't want your money. We don't want your shoes. What we want you to do, if you want to help us, go and protest your government, especially if you're in America, if that's how you're going to help us. We absolutely want your support. We want solidarity, but solidarity does not mean just giving us your old shoes. We can make our own shoes. People, there's always a cobbler somewhere in every community. We don't need shoes. What we need is real solidarity. And I think getting over these kind of paternalist notions, or the idea of giving money or giving stuff to NGOs and thinking that the NGO, that's making a change. I think that's a big problem.
And also, how would you define then, or how do you know they define themselves as, if there is such definition? Are they considering themselves as a social democracy or a communist type of community or organization? Is there a name for it?
I don't think they really think of themselves within those terms. I don't think any of those terms are really appropriate. Okay, it looks like we have another question, or maybe a qualifying question.
Yeah, she's explaining herself, so I'll read it. Sorry, I meant that, this is from Jean Kenny, that in order to promote such resistance in the West, should we uncouple resistance from the general fear of Marxism, which implies an alternate form of oligarchy? For example, the logo of the Zapatistas of the Red Star sets off alarms, obviously, of their fear.
In that case, yeah, I totally misunderstood you. I apologize for that, Janine. Yeah, I mean, I think Marxism, I think Marxism has gotten a really unfair name here in the West. It's coupled with communism and Stalinism. It's important to remember that later in his life, Marx was famously said, "I'm not a Marxist, and I'm not a communist." And he said that after his son-in-law, who was very involved in the Paris and the French Marxist and communist movement, and Marx looked at that and hated it, famously. So I mean, I see you agree. But yeah, so I think we do need to uncouple it, if not from Marxism, maybe from Marxism, but not from Marx, if that makes sense. And certainly from communism, absolutely from communism, because communism already has a signification of, Stalinism, really, or Maoism, which is, even fucking worse.
Yes. So in terms of how it is currently functioning and organized, I want to know how they ensure that, rather asking whether they ensure that everyone has their basic necessities, because we advocate the provision of a basic income, a living income. So obviously within the context of capitalism, it would be giving money, but you were mentioning that there they don't use money as much. So how does this organization take place in terms of ensuring that everyone has access to their basics?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that just happens at the very basic kind of community level, like, again, it's what we have to think about in Mexico City or London or New York is a very, well, in some ways at least, a different set of problems that then they had to think about at the time in Chiapas. At the time in Chiapas, hunger, literacy, um, prevention of curable diseases, death by curable diseases was off the charts at the time in Chiapas. These were much more so than a basic income. They had to think about these things. Through a lot of solidarity work with doctors from Europe, from the United States, from Latin America, from northern areas of Mexico, Mexico City, they set up their own medical centers. And then with a lot of help from, they've always had very strong ties with the Autonomous University in Mexico City, very, very strong ties with that group. So a lot of kind of radical teachers. And you get this now throughout Mexico, the students that just disappeared, were all part of a radical teaching college. So this kind of idea of a radical education really became prominent post 94. Setting up these kind of education initiatives where the way the schools function is you learn something and then you teach to the grade beneath you. So it's kind of I can't say trickle down because that has horrible meaning.
Hierarchical.
Yeah, but it's this kind of way of like, first you learn and then you teach, then you learn and then you teach. This kind of movement like that.
Yeah.
So you're always teaching and you're always kind of a student in the same way. And then, everyone kind of works, within producing food, producing whatever they need to produce, in a very basic level, clothes. But again, since it's not a model, you can't really apply this in Mexico City, for example. But there's this concept that you may or may not be familiar with. It's called metamodel. A metamodel was developed by the theorist Felix Guattari. Guattari was a kind of radical French group analyst, philosopher, militant. And a model is basically like a blueprint, right? It's like a blueprint of whatever to do, and you have to follow the instructions exactly. A metamodel is meant to be more of an overlay. You can adopt or choose not to adopt the tactics as they suit your situation. And that's very much what Zapatismo is. And this is what the Zapatistas and their communiques have always said. Okay, so look at, say, Mexico City. You have to say, these are our priorities. This is what we need. This is what we can do. These are our abilities, our skills. This is the solidarity networks we have, globally, as well as nationally and locally. So then you kind of, within the certain principles of this meta model, self-reliance, autonomy, equal participation, direct democracy. How do we organize ourselves? What do we do now? Like in Harlem, La Barrio, like the way that they are, or La Barria, the way that they. Sorry, my Spanish pronunciation is horrible.
It's okay.
The way that they organize themselves is very different. A lot of them actually do come from Mexico. Migrant workers, often illegal. A lot of the similar problems that you saw in Chiapas in '94, lack of education, a lot of basic problems with gender equality, a lot of racism, a lot of racial discrimination from the wider community. A lot of them were working in service industry, a lot of them were cleaners. So they kind of took their specific skill set and their specific environment and they adopted it in their claiming of autonomy. They very much organize their own neighborhood now. They organize their own schools, a lot of their own education. They are teaching them English specifically, since a lot of them only have Spanish, to the children, and that they organize foods and meals now. And that they're trying to work out a system so even though they're economically disadvantaged, they're supporting each other, so their material needs are met to a greater degree, as well as unionizing with their respective jobs and cleaning companies in order to guarantee themselves living wages. And that's a very specific focus of what they're doing. The tactics are all very specific, but this larger strategy is the same, and it conforms with the tenets of Zapatismo. Same in northern Syria, 180 degrees different situation. 180 degrees, especially in a state of constant active war with ISIL. But so the tactics are radically different, but yet the strategy and the organizing principles are the exact same. So that's the way the meta model functions.
That's very interesting, because the proposal that we have could be also considered as a meta model, because it is meant to be a set of principles that are applied precisely to ensure the right and access to these basic necessities, to sovereignty, to develop direct democracy, self-responsibility, self-governance, and all of these applied differently around the world. But we do want to create like this general notion of like the way to consider, or the way forward, so to speak, in terms of what can people apply according to their circumstances. So that is a very interesting aspect, and we definitely then agree with Zapatismo in that sense, I'd say.
Oh, exactly. Because I mean, you can't be really programmatic, and apply the same tactics to different locations. It just doesn't work. This is why a Cuban revolution can only happen at that specific time and that specific moment in Cuba. It couldn't happen, in America at that moment. Not at all.
Absolutely. So we're kind of getting to the last phase of the Hangout. So I'd like you to simply share from your perspective what has also motivated you to make of this subject like your main point of interest, and also why you would suggest it to people to consider it as a model for global political change.
Well, I mean personally, or from I suppose anecdotally, 94 was a very important year for me. I was 15 January 1st, and grew up at the Mexican border. So, the events of 94 were very well covered, and people were very much afraid in my hometown that this was going to be an armed revolution coming all the way up to Arizona, where I'm from. And people were scared, like the kind of racist white population in Arizona. A lot of them were like, well, we got our guns, we'll kill all the Mexicans if they come across the border, and this kind of stuff. And that worried me, especially perhaps coming from a somewhat, lefty family, although they don't really think of themselves in these terms. I was always kind of sympathetic to these discourses. And then I always kind of kept an eye on what was happening in Mexico, and and traveled to Mexico and lived in Latin America for a while. And then as I got older, I became more active with different, like, kind of anarchist and revolutionary groups, and just saw how the groups kept eating themselves up. Like, every time you had a different idea or suggested a different tactic, a lot of times you were branded, a reformer or a sellout, or you're being too Marxist in your anarchist critique, or you're being too anarchist in your Marxist critique, or the way gender politics and disabled politics and queer politics played itself out, in a lot of these groups was always really problematic, and oftentimes would end up eating itself up. And then people became so rigid in their identity, as a green anarchist, I will never work with those, motherfucking red anarchists or Marxists or whatever. So for me, I just thought we needed a new model, and people kept talking about, the Jacobians, as their model for change, or else they look to the Spanish Revolution and the anarchists there as their model for change. And for me, I was always like, yeah, but the Jacobians ended with Napoleon, and then the Spanish anarchists were just killed after a few months of holding a couple of cities. So there has to be something more sustainable. And all the while, the Zapatista communities were growing and strengthening, and everybody lost interest. That's what was really interesting, was that I remember talking to academics and activists about this, even recently, and I was like, oh, well, why don't you think of Zapatismo? They're like, oh, they're just really 90s, But maybe the problem is that they're 1990s rather than 1790s. I don't know. But so that was always a problem for me, and that's why I was like, there's something going on there that I need to investigate. I think there's a sustainable model for change that's infinitely more egalitarian and infinitely more radical than what we talk about with revolution. So that's what prompted me to investigate this. And after doing this for a few years now, I'm more convinced than ever that there's a real radical change there that has the capacity for global transformation, that is moving so slowly that it's easy to overlook, but because it's moving slowly, that's what gives it its power.
Great. So let's end up with that realization of yours, because that is part of what we also want to present and share with people, to know that there are solutions. They are not promoted. It's not here in Mexico, of course, so that, well, now that we have understood more about it and have cleared the name of Zapatismo with all of this that you've explained, thanks a lot for this discussion. And we will be also looking forward to the material, the monographies that you're going to be publishing soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
Or in the future, so we will keep time in context here. So thanks a lot for being here, Anthony. It was great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this.
Yes, very much, and educating ourselves on this, including myself as Mexican. I have cleared up my framework of reference to Zapatismo quite a lot, so thank you for that as well. And thanks to you, the viewer, as well. We will be meeting once again next week on Sunday to a next Living Income Guaranteed Hangout. So see you next time. Bye, Anthony.
See you. Bye.